Pirates, the thieves of the seven seas. None are more famous than the infamous Blackbeard. At his peak, he commanded at most 25 ships with a crew of 2,000. That's nice, but with a fleet of over 300 ships and a crew of about 17,000 people, that makes Blackbeard's reign over the West Indies look like child's play. This is the story of Ching Shih, the pirate princess. Let's take a moment and talk about it. Hello, and welcome back to Moment of Zhen, a podcast about everything and nothing. I'm your host, as always, Johnson Zhen. And before we begin, as always, I just want to thank you all so much for your support. If you're enjoying this podcast, keep those ratings, reviews, and subscriptions coming. They really help this podcast out in the business ends of things. And yeah, so enough of that. Let's get started. This week, the story begins in Guangdong province in 1775. If you listened from the first episode of the podcast, you know that Guangdong is a coastal region in the southern part of China. Born Xiang sometime in 1775, the exact date is unknown since she was born in a very poor family. At that time, not only were records and record keeping not very well kept, being poor meant that unless your parents kept records of your birth, there was no official document of your birth. And I want to clarify that eventually Xi Yang changes her name to Ching Shih after her husband dies. She also changes her name several times in her early adulthood, but to be consistent, I'll refer to her as Ching Shih since that's the name she's most well known for. And this kind of goes to show how easy it was in the 1700s to completely change your name and identity so easily. So there's not a lot of information or credible sources about Ching Shih's early childhood, though I would guess that given her circumstances and what most people were doing at the time in Guangdong, her parents were probably farmers, and she probably worked on her parents' farm from when she was able to until maybe she was an adult. In terms of education, again, this is my guess based on the circumstances of the time, but I think it's safe to say that she probably didn't go to school, or if she did, it couldn't have been more than just a few years until she was back again working at her farm for her parents. But it's also possible that maybe her dad worked as a fisherman, which would make a lot of sense, as you'll see later. Again, this is my own speculation, and I don't have any sources for this, so don't quote me on this. Anyways, when Ching Shih became an adult, she moved into the city of Guangzhou, which is the largest city in the Guangdong province. There isn't any information about why she moved to Guangzhou or when she moved there. But what we do know is that when she was 26 years old, she worked as a sex worker at a brothel somewhere in the city. The reason why I said there wasn't any information about why she initially moved to Guangzhou is because for most women that enter into the sex industry, that's usually not their first career choice, and most of the time, a number of circumstances put a lot of these women into these positions where sex work is their only option. And in Ching Shih's case, we don't know what led her to sex work, but that's not important because it's who she meets while working at the brothel where this story truly begins. So while Ching Shih was working at the brothel, one of her patrons became infatuated with her. And that patron was Zhen, who was a pirate. Again, there's not a lot of information about Zhen, except that he commanded a small fleet of ships called the Red Flag Fleet. Zheng would often visit Ching Shih at the brothel whenever he came back into land. it was obvious at this point that Ching Shih was special to him. So what did he do? Well, he followed the advice of Beyonce and put a ring on it. Now, there is a dispute among historians about exactly how Zhang proposed to Ching Shih. The first account is that Zhang ordered his men to raid the brothel that Ching Shih worked at and essentially kidnapped her and brought her back to his ship. Now that's romantic. The other account is that Zhang personally visited Ching Shih at the brothel and proposed to her there. But regardless of how Zhang proposed to Ching Shih, she only agreed to marry him if he agreed to give her an equal share of the loot and that she would help him run the pirate organization. Just imagine this: you're a sex worker that probably has few to no other options in life, and in comes this pirate, a freaking pirate, mind you, and that pirate asks to marry you, and you're like, sure, I'll marry you if you give me half your income and let me run your ships. And the craziest part to me is that Zhang, a freaking pirate, he agreed to these terms of their marriage. So for the next 6 years, the Red Flag fleet grew from about 200 ships to about 600 ships under the command of both Zhang and Ching Shih. They also formed alliances with other pirates and eventually formed the Cantonese Pirate Coalition and grew to about 1,700 ships total. Unfortunately for Zhang, on November 16th, 1807, he was caught in a typhoon near Vietnam and wasn't able to survive that ordeal. Though it was unfortunate for Zhang, his death meant there was a vacancy in the command of the fleet. Ching Shih, who was already helping run the ship, convinced her adoptive son, Chang Pao, who was the second in command, to support her in taking full command of the fleet. So Chang Pao's story is that he was originally the son of a fisherman that Zhang had captured. He was about 15 years old at the time of his capture and was forced to become a pirate. Pao was able to quickly gain favor with Zhang because of how intelligent and brave and skilled he was at fighting. This led Zhang to adopt Pao as his own son and gave him the role of being second in command. And when Zhang and Ching Shih got married, she also adopted Pao as her stepson and made him her legal heir. So technically, when Zhang died, Pao, who was second in command, became the commander of the Red Flag fleet. But Ching Shih had already made a name for herself in the 6 years of marriage with Zhang, or to Zhang. She knew that in order to keep the legitimacy of her status and authority, she would need to gain and maintain the favor of Zhang's relatives. This is really important because the death of Zhang created a sort of power vacuum among the pirate alliance. So with the help of Zhang's nephew and his cousin's son, they vouched for Ching Shih's place as leader among the alliance. The other captains of the other ships accepted her place as the de facto leader of the Red Flag fleet, with the help of Zhang's nephew and cousin's son, as well as Pao himself, who basically abdicated his role as commander to his stepmother. But like I said before, because of the time we're in, the captain of the fleet was still technically Pao, since only men were technically allowed to be captain, but the true power was under Ching Shih's hands. Pao wasn't completely powerless though. He still helped his stepmother with day-to-day operations and was still accepted by many of the pirates. Basically, he was still the second in command. As soon as Ching Shih took command of the Red Flag fleet, she immediately set out a code of laws that every pirate needed to follow. These laws were strictly enforced without exception, and they are: you must obey all orders. If you disobey, your head will be chopped off and your body will be thrown overboard into the ocean. Stealing anything from the common plunder before it was divided up will get your head chopped off and your body thrown into the ocean. Stealing from villagers that help supply the pirates will result in your head getting cut off and body into the ocean. All goods taken as booty must be taken for group inspection. The loot that was registered to whoever brought it to their fleet leader, he is allowed to keep 20% of the loot, and the rest is placed into the public fund. Any money that was looted must be turned in to the leader. That money will be used to buy supplies for ships that were unsuccessful with their raids. Failure to turn in money will result in whipping, though depending on the amount that you withhold, well, you've guessed it, your head comes off and your body's swimming in the ocean. If you ever go AWOL, well, your head will go AWOL as well. And for those of you who don't know what AWOL is, it's absent without leave. And finally, if you ever decide that pirating, maybe it's not for you, or maybe you want to retire from the organization, well, I'm sorry to say, but your head... No, I'm just kidding. Only your ears will get chopped off. For the most part, these codes aren't too surprising and are kind of what you would expect from pirates. But what made Ching Shih's code special was that she added extra provisions to the code that only applied to the female captives. Rape of any women that had been captured was strictly forbidden and resulted in a head chopping and body in the ocean. Even consensual sex with captured women was forbidden, at least while on duty. Punishment for men was getting their heads chopped off, while the women were spared from a beheading. Instead, they would have cannonballs tied to their feet and they were thrown overboard. I personally would rather get my head chopped off and just let it end there. Drowning is probably much worse since you'll be struggling knowing that there's nothing you can do and you'll experience a much slower and painful death, at least in my opinion. Moving on, captured women who were deemed, quote, ugly or, quote, unattractive or were set free unharmed. I'm not going to say anything else about this. You can take this however you want. The more attractive women that were captured were available for purchase by anyone. If a pirate bought a captured woman, he was considered to be married to her and must treat her well. And if he didn't treat her well, he would get the good old beheading. Again, take this however you want. I mean, yeah, it's kind of making the best out of a bad situation, I guess. Let me know what you think. So under Ching Shih's command, the Red Flag Fleet established hegemony over many coastal cities and villages around southern China. In many cases, she imposed taxes and levies on many of the cities she visited. These taxes essentially granted the villages safety, either from them or other pirates. Of course, if a village didn't comply with the taxes, they would be punished. In one account, the coastal village of Shangshang did not pay their dues to Ching Shih, so she beheaded 80 men and abducted their women and children and sold them to slavery. As you might expect, Ching Shih's control of the South China Sea didn't sit well with the Chinese government. The emperor raised himself a massive armada of ships to try to deal with the Red Flag Fleet. But unfortunately for him, Ching Shih was a brilliant military strategist, and she easily defeated the emperor's navy. Not only did she handily beat his navy, she also managed to steal 63 ships from him and convinced the surviving crew of his navy to join her. Well, not so much as convinced, but between getting your head chopped off or joining her and her pirates, I think the decision's a pretty easy one. And not only was Ching Shih deadly at sea, she could also hold her own on land. But whenever she got into land, it wasn't surprising to see an army wanting to take her head. But again, those armies were easily defeated. In one instance, two towns banded together to form a makeshift army to try to ambush her when she came to collect their taxes. Needless to say, it didn't work. And if you haven't been paying attention for the past 15 minutes, pulling a stunt like this would really piss her off. And that's exactly what happened. After she defeated the combined army of those two towns, she went into each of the towns and beheaded every single man in both of those towns. And of course, she ransacked and looted both towns. She's a pirate after all. At their peak in 1810, Ching Shih commanded about 1,800 ships and about 70 to 80,000 pirates, with about 17,000 men directly under her control. And like all good things, they must come to an end. So after the countless defeats of his navy, the emperor, you can imagine, wasn't very happy. He knew that his ships were obviously no match against her, so instead of trying to beat her with his own ships, he hired the British, Portuguese, and Dutch navies to take her down. In addition to this, he also enlisted the help of other Chinese pirates to try to take her down. So basically, now you have the entire South China Sea against her. And of course, they were no match for her. For the next 2 years, these mercenary sailors tried their best at beating Ching Shih, but time and time again, she was able to beat whoever came at her way. One notable victory she had was the capture of British Navy officer Richard Glasspool and about 7 of his sailors in 1809. This was a massive victory for Ching Shih because at the time, the Royal Navy was considered to be the strongest navy in the world. Granted, the Royal Navy's best and brightest weren't stationed at China, it still meant a lot to take down a British ship. Even though Ching Shih was winning all of her naval battles with the different navies that were coming for her, she was coming out of those battles with a net loss. Constant battles meant that she was losing more and more of her ships and pirates and wasn't able to replace the men and ships that she had lost. Of course, the emperor didn't know this, and he was growing tired of trying to take her down since he was spending a lot of money paying for mercenary work. So instead of trying to capture her, the emperor gave up and offered amnesty for her and her pirates. Initially, Ching Shih rejected the terms of the amnesty, but after suffering a major loss in a victory against the Portuguese navy, she realized that there was no way for her to keep this up forever. So in 1810, she unexpectedly showed up at the house of the Governor General of Guangzhou to discuss the terms of her amnesty. The terms of the deal that she negotiated were that the Red Flag Fleet would disband and their ships would be surrendered to the Chinese government. In return, all pirates would be granted amnesty and they would be allowed to keep their loot. The exception to this was 376 of her crew, who did receive punishment for their involvement in piracy. 126 of them were executed, while the other 250 were punished in another way. There isn't any information as to why these 376 people were punished, but I'm guessing they probably did something before they became pirates. And as for Ching Shih, well, it gets a little weird. So in addition to receiving amnesty, she negotiated the rights to be given a noble title, which entitled her to several legal protections under the aristocracy. That's not the weird thing though. She also asked the emperor to dissolve the mother and son relationship between her and her stepson Chang Pao so that they could get married. I mean, they're technically not blood related, so it's not quite like Oedipus, but to me it's still a little weird, but who am I to judge? So Ching Shih and Chang Pao would have a son and daughter together. Chang Pao also joined the Chinese Navy, but he died at sea 12 years later in 1822. After his death, Ching Shih moved back to Guangzhou, where she opened a gambling house and a brothel. And finally, in 1844, Ching Shih, who retired as a pirate at age 35, died in bed surrounded by her family at age 69. Can you imagine sitting there at her bedside, knowing that she was one of the strongest and most successful pirates in Chinese history? And she's grandma. What do you even say to that? There's nothing you could really say to that besides, wow. And that's the story of Ching Shih, the pirate princess. And if you enjoyed the story, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe for more. And with that said, thank you all so much for tuning in. This has been your Moment of Zen. Until next time, take care, stay fresh. See ya!